It began with a whisper, not in public, not in parliament, but inside palace walls thick enough to bury secrets for generations. A trusted source, someone who had stood in the shadow of the throne, revealed something explosive. Charles had made a private decision. A choice that stunned senior royals. He had chosen Catherine's children. And when that revelation surfaced, one royal figure stepped forward with unexpected force: Princess Anne. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The whisper did not travel loudly, but it traveled fast. It slipped through private offices and behind closed doors where loyalty is measured in silence. According to the Palace Insider, this was not a sentimental gesture from a grandfather softening with age. This was deliberate, calculated. A move designed to shift the monarchy's center of gravity. Charles had not merely expressed pride in Catherine's children, he had positioned them quietly, strategically, as the monarchy's secured horizon. And those who understood the mechanics of royal power felt the tremor immediately. Because decisions like this are never casual. They redraw maps. Senior aides, some of whom had served through decades of turbulence, were reportedly blindsided. They had expected gradual adjustments, incremental grooming, subtle public emphasis. Instead, they found themselves confronted with something far more decisive. Access to certain briefings was adjusted. Long-term planning conversations began to reference the next generation with unusual urgency. The phrase "future secured" began circulating in hushed tones, not as celebration but as confirmation that something fundamental had shifted. And when that phrase echoes through palace corridors, it signals permanence. What made the revelation even more startling was the alleged timing of William's awareness. Insiders suggested he was informed later than expected. Not excluded but not centered either. That nuance mattered. Because in royal dynamics, sequence equals signal. To be informed last is to feel the tremor secondhand. William, heir apparent, suddenly confronted the reality that the chessboard had been rearranged with his children already in motion. It was not rebellion. It was not betrayal. But it was bold. And boldness inside an institution built on restraint creates friction that no public smile can entirely conceal. Catherine's children, still young, still shielded by careful appearances, were reportedly granted unseen strategic favor. Increased mentorship. Earlier exposure to internal counsel. More deliberate narrative shaping. This was not about public headlines. It was about internal architecture. Charles was not decorating a legacy. He was reinforcing it. And in doing so, he accelerated the weight resting on small shoulders who had not asked for acceleration. The monarchy had always believed in destiny unfolding slowly. This felt different, faster, intentional. Then came the development that confirmed the seriousness of it all. Princess Anne stepped forward. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but decisively. Her increased presence was subtle yet unmistakable. For decades, she had embodied discipline and endurance, rarely inserting herself into generational politics. Yet now, her alignment signaled institutional backing. If Anne was stepping in, this was no experimental adjustment. This was consolidation. Tension rippled outward. Extended branches of the family recalculated. Advisors whispered about optics and risk. But Charles did not retreat. If anything, he appeared steadier, more resolved, as if he had already anticipated resistance and accepted it as collateral, because to secure a future, one must risk the present. And that is precisely what this decision seemed to do. But what exactly had Charles chosen, and why would such a decision force Princess Anne, the monarchy's most disciplined guardian, to step forward now? For decades, Charles studied history like a map of warnings. He watched institutions crumble. He saw heirs falter. And somewhere in that long, quiet observation, a private calculus formed. When the palace source described why Charles chose Catherine's children, it wasn't framed as favoritism. It was survival. A deliberate, almost surgical move to stabilize a monarchy trembling beneath generational tension. The decision, according to those who understood his thinking, had been forming for years long before whispers ever escaped palace corridors. Charles had lived through fracture. He had watched public trust fluctuate, seen private disagreements erupt into global spectacle, and felt the strain of a modern monarchy forced to perform stability while quietly absorbing internal shocks. Loyalty, he learned, was not inherited simply by blood. It was cultivated, reinforced, guarded, and in his most guarded reflections, he reportedly questioned whether extended branches of the family could consistently offer that steadiness in the decades ahead. It was not accusation. It was assessment. A sovereign's burden is not sentiment, it is continuity. Charles viewed Catherine's children not merely as beloved grandchildren, but as embodiments of discipline shaped by two carefully balanced parents. In their upbringing, he saw structure. He saw restraint. He saw a rhythm that aligned with the crown's deeper needs. Where others saw youth and innocence, he saw long-term insulation against volatility. He believed the monarchy must be fortified 2 generations forward, not merely prepared for the next coronation, but secured for the one beyond that. Advisors, as the palace source revealed, cautioned him about perception. Optics matter. Appearances of favoritism can fracture fragile unity. Yet Charles proceeded, not recklessly, but resolutely. Because in his mind, hesitation was a greater risk than controversy. He had spent a lifetime waiting for accession, for validation, for the right moment. Now he felt the moment compressing. Time, he reportedly confided to one confidant, was no longer an abstract horizon. It was finite. And with finiteness comes urgency. The mechanics of the choice were subtle but powerful. Increased access to confidential briefings, carefully expanded mentorship, exposure to conversations typically reserved for seasoned heirs. These were not gestures for public applause. They were internal calibrations, the kind that alter destiny quietly before the world notices. Charles was not simply elevating Catherine's children, he was integrating them earlier into the monarchy's core. And once that integration begins, it cannot easily be reversed. Crucially, Princess Anne had been consulted before implementation, discreetly, without spectacle. Her counsel was sought not for emotional reassurance, but for institutional judgment. Anne, hardened by decades of service without indulgence, understood the fragility of public trust. If she endorsed acceleration, it meant the risk had been weighed carefully. Her agreement signaled alignment at the monarchy's most disciplined level. And when Anne aligns, others pay attention even if they disagree. This was not about affection. It was about legacy control. Charles had watched how unpredictability could destabilize carefully laid plans. He had witnessed narratives spin beyond containment, and he resolved that the future crown must be shielded not just by ceremony, but by preparation anchored in loyalty and restraint. Catherine's children represented that architecture. To him, they were not symbols of preference. They were pillars in progress. But strategy, no matter how refined, always carries consequence. Decisions made to protect can unintentionally provoke. Consolidation can feel like exclusion. And even the most calculated move can ripple through hearts unprepared for its implications. Yet if this decision was about protecting the crown, why did it spark quiet resistance from within the family itself? When William learned of his father's private strategy, the silence said more than any confrontation could. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't gratitude either. It was something more complicated, a future being rearranged without his full command. And while the public saw unity, insiders describe a night of reflection that would redefine father, son, and sovereign forever. He had always understood that the crown moves in layers. That preparation begins long before ceremony. But this felt different, accelerated, intentional in a way that subtly shifted gravity. On paper, the move strengthened his children's future beyond measure. It fortified their position, embedded them earlier into the monarchy's inner framework, and shielded them from uncertainty. A father could feel pride in that. An heir, however, might feel something else, an awareness that the timing was no longer entirely his to control. There are whispers that Catherine was briefed before William in one version of events. If true, it would not have been a betrayal, but it would have been symbolic. Sequence matters in royal life. Being informed second can feel like standing half a step behind your own destiny. William reportedly did not react with anger. He reacted with contemplation. He asked questions few others dared to ask. Was this acceleration necessary? Was it wise to increase the weight on young shoulders before their time? And perhaps most quietly of all, did this suggest his father doubted his pace, his stewardship, his ability to shape the future gradually? The move altered more than access. It altered dynamics. Authority within a monarchy is rarely loud, but it is deeply felt. Charles had, in effect, signaled that he was not merely guiding the present but actively shaping the post-William era. That realization pressed against William's sense of responsibility. He had spent years building a careful, modern image measured, thoughtful, protective of his children's privacy. Now the architecture of their path was being strengthened from above, and the reinforcement carried both security and pressure. A confidential exchange between William and Anne reportedly followed. Not dramatic, not confrontational, but weighty. Anne, steadfast and unsentimental, is said to have framed the decision as structural, not personal. Stability requires foresight. Preparation requires courage. William listened. He recognized the brilliance in the strategy. Politically, it was difficult to challenge. Strategically, it was airtight. Yet emotionally, it was costly. Because every advancement meant his children's lives would narrow sooner. Expectations would intensify. Childhood would compress. The burden on George, Charlotte, and Louis reportedly deepened overnight, even if they could not yet articulate it. Increased scrutiny. Heightened symbolism. Subtle shifts in how they were spoken about within internal conversations. The future had drawn closer to them, and William felt that shift acutely. A father's instinct is to shield, an heir's duty is to prepare. Now those instincts collided within him. Public appearances began to carry a slightly altered tone, more measured, more united, almost protective in their composure. Smiles remained, gestures remained steady, but insiders sensed recalibration. William was not resisting his father's move. He was absorbing it, understanding that unity must prevail outwardly even if questions lingered inwardly. And in that quiet absorption, the monarchy avoided visible fracture, but tension did not disappear. It simply settled beneath the surface. But while William processed quietly, another royal figure chose not to remain silent. Princess Anne does not posture. She does not grandstand. And she does not intervene without cause. So when insiders revealed that Anne stepped forward following Charles's choice, palace veterans understood the magnitude instantly. This was the monarchy's most disciplined warrior, aligning herself with a generational pivot. And her involvement changed everything. Anne's strength has never relied on spectacle. It rests on consistency. Decades of relentless duty. A life lived without indulgence, without complaint, without deviation. So when she began appearing more frequently beside Catherine's children quietly, steadily the message resonated louder than any public declaration. This was not coincidence. This was alignment. Her presence carried weight, and weight inside a monarchy functions as endorsement. Without speaking a single provocative word, she signaled that the shift Charles had initiated was not impulsive. It was supported at the institution's core. Privately, insiders suggest, she moved even more decisively. Protocols surrounding George's preparation reportedly tightened. Not dramatically, not harshly, but deliberately. Exposure to structured mentorship deepened. Expectations became clearer. Anne understands preparation as discipline, not pressure. Yet discipline demands endurance. She reinforced that endurance early, believing that strength formed in youth becomes resilience in crisis. It was not about removing childhood. It was about fortifying character before scrutiny intensified beyond control. There are claims she advised Charles to act swiftly before opposition consolidated. In royal politics, hesitation invites resistance. Anne, seasoned by years of watching hesitation erode authority, reportedly encouraged decisiveness. If the future must be secured, secure it fully. Half measures breed speculation. Firm moves silence uncertainty. Her counsel was not emotional, it was institutional. And Charles, recognizing her steadiness, listened. But stepping forward also meant assuming responsibility for implementation. Anne positioned herself as guardian of this transition, ensuring that acceleration did not descend into chaos. She bridged the generational gap, translating Charles' urgency into practical preparation. For Catherine, this mentorship became invaluable. Anne offered more than advice, she offered reinforcement. How to withstand scrutiny, how to preserve dignity under speculation, how to remain steady when the world amplifies whispers into storms. Their relationship reportedly deepened, grounded in mutual respect rather than performative alliance. Yet not all within the family interpreted her involvement neutrally. Some saw it as a declaration of allegiance, a power endorsement that tilted internal balance unmistakably. Anne's alignment made resistance more difficult. To challenge Charles now meant indirectly challenging Anne's judgment, a daunting prospect for anyone aware of her influence. The monarchy may appear ceremonial from the outside, but internally, credibility is currency, and Anne's credibility is nearly untouchable. There were quiet warnings as well. Insiders recall her cautioning that hesitation would invite fractures. That uncertainty breeds factions. If consolidation was the goal, it had to be visible enough internally to discourage doubt, yet measured enough externally to avoid backlash. Anne has always understood that the crown survives not by pleasing everyone, but by remaining coherent. And coherence requires clarity. Her involvement reframed the narrative. What had seemed like Charles's solitary gamble now felt like a coordinated safeguard. The message became unmistakable. This was not favoritism born of affection. This was architecture reinforced by experience. Catherine's children were not being elevated in isolation. They were being anchored by one of the monarchy's most unwavering figures. But power shifts rarely unfold without discomfort. When authority consolidates in one direction, those standing slightly outside that arc begin to feel the cold edge of exclusion. And while Anne's decisive alignment strengthened the monarchy's internal spine, it also stirred unease in corners where influence once flowed more freely. But not everyone inside the palace welcomed Anne's decisive alignment. Behind polished smiles and ceremonial appearances, something shifted. Courtiers whispered. Branches of the family recalculated. Because Charles' decision, now reinforced by Anne, did more than elevate Catherine's children. It quietly redrew influence lines. And in a monarchy where perception is power, that redraw carried consequences no one could ignore. The adjustment was never announced, yet it was felt. Invitations subtly altered. Access quietly restructured. Conversations that once included a broader circle became more concentrated. Extended family members, long accustomed to proximity and relevance, allegedly sensed the shift almost immediately. No one confronted Charles directly. That is not how royal resistance works. Instead, questions filtered through advisors. Concerns framed as loyalty rather than objection. But beneath the careful phrasing lay a deeper unease. Were they being strategically sidelined? Whispers of favoritism began circulating among private aides, not as public accusation, but as cautious speculation. In a monarchy that survives on balance, the appearance of imbalance can be as dangerous as the reality itself. Advisors reportedly debated optics late into the night. Consolidation brings stability, they argued, but exclusion breeds resentment. Was this move consolidating strength or narrowing it too sharply? The question hung unanswered, pressing against the walls of discretion. Discussions intensified around a single tension: consolidation versus inclusion. Charles appeared to believe that focus would prevent fracture. Some within the institution feared the opposite, that narrowing influence too visibly might accelerate the very divisions it sought to prevent. And once doubt begins circulating internally, it rarely stays contained. A few aides quietly expressed anxiety about media fallout should these recalibrations leak. Headlines would not frame it as strategy. They would frame it as preference. And perception, once ignited, spreads faster than explanation. Yet Charles did not retreat. If anything, insiders describe him as immovable. He had weighed the risk and accepted it. He understood that leadership often demands discomfort. The crown, in his view, required clarity, not appeasement. The future could not be shaped by endless consultation. It required decisive direction. That resolve unsettled some who preferred gradual evolution over visible acceleration. But hesitation was not part of his current calculus. Anne's role in suppressing early dissent proved pivotal. She reportedly addressed concerns firmly, without hostility, but without softness either. Unity, she reminded them, was not optional. The monarchy cannot project cohesion if it fractures internally over strategic positioning. Her authority silenced much of the early murmuring. When Anne draws a line, it is rarely crossed twice. Meanwhile, Catherine bore the invisible weight of mounting scrutiny with controlled composure. She did not comment. She did not signal triumph. Instead, she maintained steadiness in public engagements, reinforcing an image of quiet dedication. That restraint became its own statement. If she felt the tension, she did not reveal it. But insiders suggest she understood the cost of this consolidation more deeply than most. The elevation of her children inevitably cast shadows elsewhere. And shadows breed emotion. The palace remained outwardly serene. Ceremonies unfolded. Speeches were delivered. Smiles held firm. Yet beneath that polished surface, recalibration continued. Influence shifted in subtle degrees. Loyalties adjusted. And though no open rebellion surfaced, the emotional undercurrent thickened. Consolidation had strengthened the crown's future, but it had also stirred internal sensitivity that could not be ignored indefinitely. And while political tremors rippled through corridors of power, a quieter transformation was taking place in a far more personal sphere, one that would shape not just strategy but destiny itself. Yet beneath the political tremors, the most profound impact was unfolding within Catherine herself. Catherine never asked for acceleration. She never demanded preference. But when the palace source revealed Charles's reasoning, it reframed her position entirely. She was no longer simply preparing her children for distant destiny, she was stewarding a future, now moving toward them faster than expected. And the weight of that realization was both empowering and sobering. For years, she had approached motherhood within the monarchy with deliberate patience. Shield first. Prepare gradually. Let childhood breathe before history tightens its grip. That had been the rhythm. But Charles's decision altered that rhythm overnight. The horizon drew closer. The abstract became immediate. And while she did not protest, insiders say she understood that delay was no longer a luxury. If the institution was accelerating around her children, she would not allow them to be unready. Private education reportedly intensified not in harshness, but in intention. Conversations deepened. Context expanded. Lessons once framed as distant responsibilities began carrying present relevance. Catherine is said to have approached it not as pressure but as grounding. If scrutiny was coming sooner, resilience had to come first. If symbolism would attach itself to their names earlier than expected, then understanding must precede expectation. It was a quiet transformation, but it was decisive. Balancing protection with preparation became her greatest test. A mother's instinct pulls inward, toward shelter. A future queen's duty pushes outward, toward exposure. Catherine stood at the intersection of those forces, refusing to allow either to dominate entirely. She would not strip away warmth in the name of destiny, nor would she ignore destiny in the name of comfort. That balance, fragile and relentless, became her private battlefield. Her bond with Anne reportedly strengthened during this period. Not dramatic, not ceremonial, but practical. Anne's counsel offered steel beneath Catherine's grace. Where Catherine brought emotional intelligence, Anne brought institutional endurance. Together they formed a quiet axis of preparation. It was not about performance, it was about fortification. Catherine listened carefully, absorbing lessons forged through decades of scrutiny, and she adapted without losing herself. That adaptation signaled maturity beyond expectation. Privately, she reassured William. Insiders described conversations marked by calm rather than confrontation. Unity, she emphasized, would be their greatest protection. If tension existed between generations, it would not fracture their immediate household. William may have felt unsettled by the acceleration, but Catherine anchored him in steadiness. Her composure did not erase complexity, it stabilized it. Publicly, something shifted as well. Her demeanor grew subtly more deliberate. Each appearance carried quiet authority. Not theatrical. Not forced. Simply assured. George's visibility increased in small, calculated ways, enough to signal continuity without overwhelming him. Catherine understood that scrutiny would intensify. Questions would surface. Comparisons would emerge. Yet she chose restraint over reaction. In a climate hungry for drama, she offered discipline. And that discipline masked an undeniable truth. Responsibility had expanded. Without outward complaint, without a single defensive gesture, she embraced the burden placed upon her children and herself. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. The crown does not wait for comfort. It moves when it must. And Catherine, aware of that reality, adjusted her posture to meet it. Still, the question lingered, why now? Why would Charles accelerate this shift at this exact moment? The palace source hinted at something deeper, something not yet public. Charles' decision, they claimed, was not only strategic but time-sensitive. A quiet awareness of fragility, of history moving faster than tradition allows. And if that urgency was real, then choosing Catherine's children was not merely preference. It was contingency planning for a future closer than anyone dared admit. For months, perhaps longer, Charles had reportedly been reviewing succession vulnerabilities with an intensity that surprised even seasoned advisors. Not paranoia, not panic, but calculation sharpened by experience. He had witnessed how quickly narratives can destabilize institutions, how swiftly public sentiment can turn. The crown, though ancient, is not immune to pressure. It breathes the same modern air as everything else, and that air had grown heavier. External forces were pressing in: political turbulence, social fragmentation, a public increasingly skeptical of inherited authority. Charles understood that symbolism alone would no longer sustain reverence. The monarchy required visible continuity faces that embodied renewal rather than nostalgia. Catherine's children, young and unburdened by past controversies, represented that renewal. They were not merely heirs, they were anchors in a shifting cultural tide. Then there were the whispers no one spoke loudly. Health murmurs circulating behind closed doors. Conversations cut short when staff entered rooms. The unspoken acknowledgement that time, even for a king, does not pause. Charles had spent decades waiting to lead. Now that he did, he seemed acutely aware of its fragility. Urgency replaced patience. Delay felt indulgent. If structures needed reinforcement, they had to be reinforced now. Anne reportedly pressed this point with characteristic clarity. Consolidate before doubt metastasizes. Secure the line before uncertainty invites speculation. She understood that stability must be projected decisively, not hesitantly. The monarchy cannot appear uncertain about its own trajectory. And if consolidation required discomfort internally, that discomfort was preferable to public doubt. Her counsel aligned with Charles's instinct. Hesitation could fracture more deeply than boldness. Public stability became paramount. The institution could not afford visible fragility in an era obsessed with exposure. Every gesture, every appearance, every shift in positioning carried amplified meaning. By centering Catherine's children earlier than tradition might dictate, Charles was crafting a visual narrative of longevity. He was telling the world that the future was not abstract, it was already present, already prepared. That message, if sustained, could quiet speculation before it ignited. Advisors, some cautious by nature, reportedly urged measured pacing. Accelerate too quickly and you risk backlash. Move too boldly and you risk alienation. Yet Charles refused delay. In his mind, risk lay in waiting. He had studied enough history to know that institutions often collapse not because they act, but because they hesitate. And so he moved. Not recklessly, but with a firmness that suggested he believed the clock was louder than anyone else realized. Catherine's children thus became more than beloved figures. They became signals proof that the monarchy was preparing for decades ahead, not scrambling in reaction. Their presence suggested endurance. Their elevation suggested readiness. And beneath it all lay an unmistakable undertone: something was approaching. Whether political, personal, or generational, Charles appeared determined to ensure the crown would not be caught unprepared. But as consolidation tightened and urgency crystallized, the implications extended beyond preparation. They touched identity, power, and legacy itself. And with that realization came a question that would define everything that followed. But as the future tightened into focus, one final question remained: what does this mean for the monarchy's next era? This was never about favoritism. It was about survival, about legacy carved in uncertainty. Charles chose Catherine's children not for sentiment but for stability. And when Princess Anne stepped forward, she sealed that direction with institutional force. The monarchy, once cautious and incremental, had quietly pivoted. And in that pivot, a new royal era began taking shape long before the public realized it. What began as a whisper had become architecture. The internal recalibrations, the subtle mentorships, the tightened circles of counsel, all of it now pointed in one unmistakable direction. Generational consolidation. George emerged not simply as a future king, but as a symbol of disciplined renewal. The language surrounding him shifted. He was no longer spoken of only in terms of distant inheritance. He became the embodiment of preparation in progress. The monarchy, through him, projected calm continuity, measured, deliberate, almost inevitable. Charlotte's presence carried a different kind of resonance. Observers within the institution reportedly noted her composure, her poise under increasing visibility. In a monarchy long defined by hierarchy, she began representing a quiet strength that complemented her brother's trajectory, not overshadowed, not ornamental, but purposeful. Her emergence signaled adaptability within tradition, a monarchy evolving without announcing its evolution. That subtlety was powerful. And then there was Louis, often described as the emotional bridge to the public. Where formality can distance, warmth can reconnect. His presence humanized the consolidation. He reminded observers that behind institutional strategy were children navigating extraordinary expectation. In that contrast between innocence and inevitability, the crown found unexpected resonance. The monarchy was not merely reinforcing authority, it was softening perception. At the center of this shift stood Catherine, no longer simply consort in waiting, but central matriarchal force. Her role expanded beyond ceremony into stewardship. She balanced steel and grace, absorbing pressure without displaying fracture. As scrutiny intensified, so did her steadiness. She became the quiet axis around which generational preparation revolved. And in doing so, she reshaped how the monarchy projected maternal authority: firm, protective, forward-looking. Anne, meanwhile, solidified her position as transitional guardian. Not the face of the future, but its protector. She bridged eras with unwavering discipline, ensuring that acceleration did not unravel into instability. Her involvement signaled that this consolidation was not impulsive, it was endorsed by experience, hardened through decades of service. In many ways, Anne's presence reassured traditionalists even as the structure evolved beneath them. William recalibrated with composure. If the pivot initially unsettled him, he transformed that tension into alignment. Public unity became paramount. He stepped into a role less defined by anticipation and more by reinforcement. The heir no longer waited passively. He actively fortified the narrative of continuity unfolding through his children. That adjustment did not diminish him. It reframed him as a father preparing heirs, not merely an heir awaiting ascension. And at the center of it all stood Charles, the strategic architect. History may one day debate his methods, but in this moment, his intent was unmistakable. He had chosen clarity over caution, consolidation over diffusion. By advancing Catherine's children within the monarchy's inner framework, he reshaped the institution's storyline. The narrative subtly shifted from transition to endurance, from uncertainty to preparation, from speculation to structure. The monarchy's image, once defined by gradual evolution, now carried the imprint of decisive foresight. Generational consolidation solidified. Influence lines redrew, expectations crystallized. And through it all, the crown projected a message without declaring it outright: the future is not approaching, it is already here. Yet history teaches that every consolidation carries unseen consequences. Strength invites scrutiny. Clarity invites challenge. And even the most carefully reinforced legacy must face the unpredictability of time. And yet, as history has shown, every consolidation of power carries unseen consequences waiting in the wings. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.